And good morning and welcome to Thursday, January 14th at the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture Winter Conference. We belong to each other. My name is Mary Fiorito and I am a fellow here at the Nicola Center, and it is my great pleasure and privilege to be moderating this session this morning on what we owe to mothers and children. And we have a marvelous array of speakers this morning, all who have been longtime advocates for pregnant women and mothers and women and the unborn. We are going to begin this morning with Vicky Thorne. That's a name for anyone who works in the pro-life movement knows almost instantaneously. Vicky was the foundress of Project Rachel, which is the Catholic Church's outreach to women and men who have been wounded by abortion. She does post-abortion healing work and has become really internationally known for that work. In fact, she's a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life, being recognized by the Church as a leading expert in the world on this issue of post-abortion healing. But she's also done incredibly fascinating work on the biology of men and women and the biology of attraction and how that plays into a culture where we might have women who face unplanned or unexpected pregnancies. In fact, I was doing a presentation myself for the 50th anniversary of Humana Vitae and came across a fascinating article in Psychology Today. I think it was entitled How the Birth Control Pill Can Affect Attraction. And again, completely secular magazine, Psychology Today, going into depth about how the pill so changes a woman's chemistry that she will be attracted to exactly the wrong person when she is looking for a compatible mate. And it was an interesting article to read, but of course I had known some of this information before because of Vicky's groundbreaking research in this area. Vicky is also the mother of 6. She resides in Milwaukee, Wisconsin with her husband, Bill Thorne, who is the former chair of the communications department at Marquette University, where he just retired, I think, within the last year. So Vicky and Bill are now finally empty nesters and are now, I think every time I talk to Vicky, there's a new grandchild either born or on the way. So now they're counting grandchildren, which is a wonderful thing. So Vicky Thorne, thank you so much for being with us. It's a pleasure. We're looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Mary. Number of grandchildren, 17. Not aware that there are any more on the way, but I expect there will be soon. The sisters seem to be having babies at the same time. I just want to say a few words as we begin this, that as we talk about mothers and children, we really need to recognize that there's a lot of biology involved here too. It isn't only psychology, it isn't only philosophy, and to recognize the importance of the fathers in all of this. Because one of the things that's happened in our society, which is really, it's a frightening thing, is that so many people are now divorced, the relationship fell apart, and nobody knows why. We all puzzle over this. And the awareness that if I am contracepting when I meet a partner, I need to go off the pill for a while to find out if he is a proper match for me in terms of biology. Nobody tells us this. And our daughters are on the pill at 14, 13, trying to get their periods regulated, all that sort of thing. And so this question of the outcome of the pill, the outreach of the pill, far beyond just simply making our periods work right, in theory, is very significant. And I'm just going to take a few minutes here as we do this to talk about some biology that people may not know about. And the first one is that there are scent molecules of affiliation that we humans perceive. Most of us can, not everybody can, but they have to do with attraction to males, the possibility of fertility. We would recognize people we are related to, our children. They allow us to become in sync with other women in their cycle. Many, many things. And again, we live in a society where everything is sort of external. And we really, I don't think, do a good job of appreciating how God made us in terms of that complexity. And that's a very important thing. We have to know that mothers carry cells of every child they ever conceive, at least 37 to 40 years. There are those who believe we carry them forever. And if we lose a child through a miscarriage or an abortion, we carry more cells from those children the rest of our lives, starting with about 500,000. And they're everywhere in our body. They morph into brain cells and tummy cells and all that kind of thing. But that ongoing connection is important. And we need to recognize that we also pass those cells on then to other children who follow. And this is ongoing research. There's still so much we don't know about it, but it's fascinating. And one of the things that I think we also have to keep in mind in light of this passing of cells is we live in a society where sex is recreational. Marriage is nice when you're ready, but many people have many sexual partners, and the recognition that we absorb and hold seminal fluid in our body for 15 hours after an act of intercourse is amazing, because we are being physiologically changed by those partners. And that awareness that if I have multiple partners, had multiple conceptions, but I might not have brought babies to term, okay? The children who follow carry these cells from those older siblings. We're not quite sure what all that does to the body, but we know that we have an epidemic of autoimmune diseases going on that we can't quite figure out, okay? If I'm carrying cells from people I'm not 100% related to, what's that doing to my body? We're not sure. But again, as God made us, we're intended for one partner, and with that partner to have our children. And those things need to kind of we need to be reminded of those things from time to time, again, because the society has gotten so absolutely out of control in terms of this whole thing. That importance of having a match with our spouse, it's called the major histocompatibility complex. Those cells that are there, again, will help our offspring to be healthier, but they also have to do with us. And if the partner is the proper partner in terms of this MHC complex, meaning he's a complement to us, these cells of our children may help us to fight off disease, okay? If the partner I have is one I chose when I was contracepting, the problem is that person is going to be too much like my father or my brother in terms, again, of the cells, this complementarity here. And that can lead to autoimmune issues, to fertility issues, to a number of things that nobody really tells us about. And I want to take just another couple minutes here to talk about the fact that again, there's many, many other changes here. This is a whole long talk. I can do a whole day on it, but that importance of knowing that this is about biology as God made us as well. And to know that fathers are an important part of this, okay? So many of our children don't know their fathers anymore because of the divorce, because of whatever. But just from a pure biological standpoint, men know we're pregnant before we know we're pregnant because our scent changes. And it begins to change his body. And after the first pregnancy for the male, his testosterone drops pretty radically during this whole event, and it never again goes as high as it was when he was a bachelor. He is physiologically changed, and that makes him a more gentle partner, a more compassionate partner, a more tender father. All of those things are important, okay? And 60 to 90% of men during pregnancy experience what's called Kuvad syndrome. And that is that he's got symptoms of pregnancy all the way through the pregnancy. And it changes all kinds of things. And what's interesting is that at the end of that, he's more responsive to the cry of his child. It's like this is a hard wiring for fatherhood. It's so amazing how God made us in terms of all these pieces of our lives. And again, I want to underline the fact that when we use chemical contraception, it changes our physiological body, changes the male we choose. If we then go off the pill, we don't find that male attractive anymore. When we're on the pill, he's not cycling with us because we're not giving off the chemistry of fertility. And he may turn to pornography, he may turn to other women. there are all these complexities that are there in terms of how the society is shifted. And so as we start this time together, I just really wanted to emphasize that fact that there are so many factors here, not only psychological, not only personality wise, but also the physiological and the things that we've not been told in terms of what's now considered, good medicine or whatever. So hopefully that's helpful in terms of just kind of setting the stage for us to talk about the rest of it.
Thank you very much, Vicki. It's such fascinating information, and unfortunately information that I think most women aren't given, and men aren't aware of either when they're in the dating and mating and marriage market. It's an interesting concept that I think at least some canon lawyers are starting to look at in terms of annulment information, because if you're chemically impaired at the time of consent, and you've chosen the wrong person because of that chemical impairment, it can have an impact on the validity of the marriage. So there's a lot more research, both, as you say, scientifically, but also canonically and ethically to be done here. And, those who are bemoaning the decreasing marriage rate, I think this is another aspect of it that hasn't been spoken about as much. So I'll be interested to see some of the questions from our listeners and our watchers here. Well, we're going to move on to our second speaker now. Thank you, Vicki. Sister Virginia Joy Cotter is a professed sister and a member of the Sisters for Life, the wonderful order of religious women founded by John Cardinal O'Connor. She currently serves as the director of the Respect Life Office for the Archdiocese of New York, a position she's held since 2017. But she previously worked at the Sisters of Life Visitation Mission, which is also located in New York City, where she accompanied women who were experiencing unplanned pregnancies and directing them in a spiritual, but also a very practical and maternal way to help them to be able to give life to their children in an atmosphere that was comforting and welcoming. So, Sister Virginia Joyce, thank you so much for joining us. We're looking very much forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much, Mary. I marvel at Vicki, how she can cover such complex and detailed information in a very short window. I'm going to talk about very simple things, and I'm going to talk for longer. So just in thinking about today, really in preparing for this panel, I was really struck by the friendship between Cardinal O'Connor, as Mary mentioned, our founder, and Mother Teresa, the quote which this conference is based on. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time just explaining a little bit who the Sisters of Life are, why we exist, how we serve women, and then share with you some of what we have learned. So to give you a little background, Cardinal O'Connor, in founding us, how does one really even begin to start a new religious community in the church? He received what he would describe as two graces, two sort of foundational graces that inspired him to begin the work of the Sisters of Life. And I'll tell you about one of them, which was the second grace. This was in the 80s, early 80s. He knew that he was Cardinal Archbishop of New York at the time, and he knew that there was tremendous work being done in the pro-life world. Many people were working tirelessly in defense of human life, and yet he recognized that there was something missing, maybe that he couldn't even articulate, but he knew something was missing. And one day in his just everyday time of prayer, he was praying with the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9. This is the passage where Jesus has sent the disciples out to cast out demons, to heal the sick, to restore sight to the blind. And you know the story. The disciples couldn't cast out one particular demon, so Jesus himself casts out that demon. And the disciples say, Lord, why is it that we couldn't cast out that demon? And Jesus responds, this kind of demon can only be driven out, can only be cast out by prayer and fasting. And in that moment of really his silent prayer, Cardinal O'Connor received what he would call a life-transforming grace, not one for himself, but for the whole church. And he recognized or identified contempt for human life as a demon that could only be driven out by prayer and fasting. And he knew God was asking him to found a religious community of women who would literally lay down their lives so that others might live. And he would tease the sisters. He had a great sense of humor over and over again. This is the last thing he ever wanted to do, was found a community of religious women. He had served as a military chaplain for nearly 30 years. Again, he was Cardinal Archbishop of New York. He had lots of things occupying his time, but he was faithful to the grace that he received. And he recognized, as St. John Paul II did in Evangelium Vitae, that life is always at the center of the battle between good and evil, between light and darkness. And he would say that the Sisters of Life really would be the spiritual response to what is a spiritual reality. Contempt for human life being a demon that could only be driven out by prayer and fasting. And so our life of prayer is primary. Our relationship with the Lord is first and foremost. And from that, sort of depth of prayer relationship with him overflows all of our missions and our works. As Mary said, we've been privileged to serve thousands and thousands of women who are pregnant and in need. Some of them actually come and live with us. So where I am right now on the west side of Manhattan, we have women living with us and their babies. We had a baby shower last night. And on the flip side, like Vicki, we work with those who are suffering the effects of abortion. And that's a real privileged mission as well, to see the Lord restore what has been broken in many ways. Really powerful. We have retreat ministry. We do a lot of evangelization, college campus ministry, obviously the Respect Life office where I am now. We have a huge network of co-workers of life that allow us to really serve these women well, and in the way in which we believe the Lord has designed. So the Cardinal says the charism of life, which is what we actually vow ourselves to, we take a fourth vow to protect and enhance the sacredness of life, is really a recovery for our culture and for the entire world of a sense of the sacred, reverence for every human person made in the image of God. Cardinal O'Connor, he would love to say his favorite Old Testament story was Moses and the burning bush. The Lord tells Moses, remove your shoes, Moses, because the ground on which you stand is holy ground. And Cardinal O'Connor said that I cannot approach any person without feeling that I should remove my shoes because where I stand is holy ground. Every person is sacred because they are made in the image and likeness of God. And Mother Teresa had this great capacity too, this sort of vision to see each individual with really wonder and awe. The full quote that this conference is based on, I love it. It says, today, if we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. That man, that woman, that child is my brother or my sister. If everyone could see the image of God in his neighbor, do you think we would still need tanks and generals? She goes on, peace and war begin at home. If we truly want peace in the world, let us begin by loving one another in our own families. And what we owe mothers and their children is love. The Lord has said, by this shall everyone know that you are my followers, that you love one another. And in our work with women who are pregnant and tempted to abortion, we have found fear to be the driving force. Scripture reminds us, it's perfect love that casts out all fear. And where there is love, there is always life. We meet women from all walks of life, cultures, circumstances, from maybe a woman living in the projects to a Manhattan professor who's faced with an adverse prenatal diagnosis. It doesn't matter. The human heart is made by the same creator, and we all long for the same types of securities, assurance. Fear does not discriminate. We know that. And it's important for us, we have found, to really come to an understanding of the fears, because fear, we've experienced, all of us individually, limits our freedom. When we make a decision in fear, we're really not free. So we desire to understand the fears to really help alleviate these fears so that the women can choose what they most, in freedom, most long to choose, which is life for their child. And to give you a glimpse maybe into the fears of these women, with her permission, I'm sharing sort of a quote from a woman that we served. And this is what she wrote to us very early on in her relationship. This is in her own words. She says, well, I am coming closer to the decision of aborting the baby I'm carrying. I'm trying my hardest to not make that decision, but it doesn't seem like there is anything else for me to do. I've tried reaching out to family, but it's gotten to the point where I think I'm bothering them more than anything. My very own Christian aunt, who claims not to believe in abortion, told me I need to go and get one. Everyone, please do not think I am overreacting, but everyone has told me flat out that I don't need to keep this baby. I don't know what else to do. My faith isn't strong enough to believe that God will carry me through this. I want to try every avenue that I may have left. I want to know so deeply that everything will be okay. I know you may not be able to tell me that, but that is all I really want to hear. That is what I want to believe. I hate myself so badly, so deeply for even letting this happen. I'm intelligent, so I thought. But this, without being married, this is crazy. So in the midst of all of this, is there any way out? Can my situation be helped? And that is just one window, a very small window into this particular individual's woman's story. And really, she has a capacity to articulate how she's feeling and what's going on. You should know she did receive the support that she needed to choose life, and we're still very much in touch with her and in her life. But this feeling of being alone without support is one of the most poignant sufferings that a pregnant woman can face. It's disorienting. It strikes at the core of her identity. And the truth is, no one is able to be totally self-reliant. We are made in the image of God, who is relational. We belong to each other, and our destiny is communion and union, not isolation or individualism. We find that material support is absolutely necessary, but much more, we find it is about love, accompaniment. It's about the woman, like I quoted, knowing that there is someone out there who cares, who can tell her she is good, she is capable, someone who believes in her when she cannot believe in herself. We had another young woman who was a teenager who actually came to us directly from Planned Parenthood. While she was in the waiting room at Planned Parenthood, very antsy and nervous, she walked over to the brochure rack, and much to our shock, one of our brochures was on the Planned Parenthood rack. I assure you, we are not we don't have a working relationship with Planned Parenthood, but we assume a sidewalk counselor passed it to someone and they put it in there. But she read this brochure as she's waiting and almost became relieved and surprised that hope rose in her heart, just as reading kind of our brochure. She flips it over, sees our address on the back, leaves Planned Parenthood, comes to us, and ends up being with us 4 hours just for that first meeting alone, just sort of emptying the bucket, telling us everything. And I'm so struck by one of the things she said. She said, since I've been pregnant, everyone in my life believed in abortion and no one believed in me. And I think that captures it. When a woman comes to us, vulnerable, pregnant, tempted, often abandoned by those she trusted, people say, well, what do you do? And in many ways, it is simple. We love her, not because we're good, but because she is so good and so worthy of being cared for and loved and accompanied, delighted in. We listen her back into life, and we hope to love her in a way that reflects back to her the good and the beauty that we see in her. So I propose, kind of as we go into the conversation, that what we owe women and children, in particularly these situations as I described, is a love that casts out fear, a love that does not undermine the legitimate struggles and sacrifices that are going to face her, and ultimately, by God's grace, a love that sets her free to receive the gift of her own life as mother and the life of her child, because love is the only proper response to the human person. So looking forward to talking with you all and hearing more.
Sister, thank you. It's those stories that really sort of put the the human flesh onto to the pro-life issue, isn't it? You know, I'm reminded very much in your remarks of a book that was written, oh, Vicki, you'll have to remind me, probably 25 years ago now. I'm really dating myself, but it was called Real Choices.
Yeah.
And it was written and edited by Frederica Matthews Green, who was one of the founding members of Feminists for Life. She got kicked out of the National Organization of Women because she was pro-life. So she started her own group with some others called Feminists for Life. And she went from the coast of LA to New York and a whole bunch of cities in between. And in each city interviewed, I think it was 9 post-abortive women, and asked them the same set of questions. What kind of support that would have made a difference did you not have? So she thought she'd come back with sort of a really good working practical list, and then we, you know, could all start attacking the things on that list. And the number one thing cited by women was I had no one to walk through the pregnancy with me. No one believed in me. No one said, you can do this. No one said, I will help. No one said, I will go with you to your doctor's appointments. I mean, this is including women's own parents. And if that wasn't the most sort of, at the time, surprising, because I guess people were thinking of material reasons, you know, women in poverty, et cetera, et cetera. And that wasn't it at all. It was a poverty of friendship and a poverty of love that was driving women to those clinics. And so I'm very grateful that it seems like even now, 25 years later, sister, that sadly, I think still remains true, as at least probably up there in the top 3 of reasons that women choose to end their pregnancies. So thank you for being so, compassionate, first of all, but even in your telling of the story, the love that you have for those women comes through very clearly. So everyone I know in the movement is so grateful to the sisters for this kind of the human face of Jesus that you present to women in need. Well, we're finally going to hear from our third panelist now, Dr. Monique Chireau Wubbenhorst, and she has a rather long and distinguished resume. So I don't like to read resumes normally or introductions, but with Monique, I have to. There's no other choice. Monique is a practicing obstetrician and gynecologist. She has been in the field of obstetrics and gynecology for 20 years, more than 20 years, I think. She is currently the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Global Health at the U.S. Agency for International Development. So you may know that as USAID. You probably see that acronym for it. She has a tremendous amount of knowledge and expertise, particularly in the areas of international health and policy research in women's health in particular. She's a graduate of Mount Holyoke College. She has her medical degree from Brown University and then a master's degree in public health from Harvard. Her clinical career has focused largely on serving underserved and disadvantaged populations in our country. She has chaired the Women and Special Populations Committee for the American Heart Association and worked as a senior consultant for the United States Veterans Administration. And she has authored a large variety of peer-reviewed articles and medical studies. And certainly her expertise is very much like Vicki is internationally known. So Dr. Chireau Wubbenhorst, welcome. And we're interested to hear what you have to say this morning.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much for the warm welcome, Mary. And it's really an honor to be here. And I'm always impressed with people who have 6 children. We have 2, but we just love to see. It's all about families. So what do we owe the unborn and mothers? You know, this is a question that I think about quite a bit. And for me, the question relates very closely to the conference theme here, which is that we do belong to one another. You know, Christ's words in Matthew 22:38 and 39, to love your neighbor and yourself, I think really are the sort of undergirding of that idea that we belong to each other and we owe things to one another because of his command to love our neighbor as to love ourselves and to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And it also inherently recognizes the image of God in human beings, and that because we are stamped with that image, we not only recognize that image in others, but honor it. And this especially applies to mothers and the unborn. Why? Because it goes back to, again, this is something I think a great deal about, the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, John 1:14. the fact of the incarnation causes us to consider how much we owe the mother and unborns, because God in his wisdom chose to come to earth as an embryo. And I talk about this with my husband, who's in the ministry all the time, because they say, oh, well, Jesus came to earth as a baby boy. Well, actually, he didn't. He came to earth as an embryo. And so when we consider the power of that thought, the fact that Jesus was a zygote, and the miracle of the incarnation, that by doing that, God dignified and honored unborn life and motherhood for all times. And again, this is something you kind of spend time thinking about. Christ, as the second member of the Godhead, the second member of the Trinity, could have come to earth in any form he wanted to. He could have come to earth in an awesome form that would make everyone bow down to him. He could have come to earth as a full-grown man, but he didn't. He chose to humble himself by coming in the weakest and most vulnerable way, which is an embryo that was
Your microphone shut down.
Monique, pardon me, Doctor, for interrupting you, but I've lost audio with you. I think, has your mic been turned off?
Oh, yeah, it looks like my computer. Okay.
Thank you.
Can
you maybe hit your 30-second back button and maybe just kind of go over a little bit of what you were saying? I think many of us might have missed that.
Okay, sure.
Pardon me for interrupting. Thank you.
No problem. Let's see. Where did my computer shut me off here? All right, I'm going to go back to John 1:14. I think that's a good place to go back to. So because and I apologize for that. My computer sometimes does that. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. So the fact of the incarnation compels us to consider how much we owe the unborn and mothers. And there are a few ways that I think this plays out. One is that God in his wisdom chose to come to earth, Christ came to earth as an embryo. And the miracle of the incarnation is that the immortal, invisible, almighty God humbles himself to take human form. And not just any human form, not just the human form of an adult, not just the human form of some awesome appearance that would make people immediately recognize him as God, but the most weak in human eyes and the most helpless. And that, in so doing, what he is showing us, what God is showing us, is that form, the unborn human form, is seen as beautiful and worthy. It's worthy because, as Andrew Murray once said it, that when we consider the human frame is made of dust. Okay, there's no difference between the mineral composition of the human frame and the mineral composition of the Earth's crust. But nonetheless, the human frame is considered worthy to contain the Holy Spirit. And not only that, God not only considered the adult human frame, the form that we see in one another, the beauty and what we consider the image of God, to be worthy, but he also considered the embryonic human frame as being worthy to contain Christ, the Messiah, who's the glory of God. So again, as John 1:14 says, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So just unpacking that a little bit, what that says is that if God dignifies conception, I'll go into OBGYN in detail here, okay? If God dignifies conception, he dignifies the implantation of the embryo, the gestation, and so on and so forth, all in the frame of the mother, all within motherhood and pregnancy. Should we not also respect and dignify and honor that? And so I think that when we begin to sort of unpack this and look at it, we do see an obligation, which is in some ways really put upon us by God, to honor the unborn and to honor motherhood because he honored it. And as Christ followers, believers, Christians, we want to walk in the footsteps of Christ, and we want to do as he did. Of course, we can't do as he did in terms of the incarnation. We want to do what the Father did, which was to which was the incarnation, and to honor and respect that. So what do we owe? I'm going to turn for a moment here from sort of theology. My husband's a theologian, and so we think about and talk about this all the time. I'm going to turn for a moment from sort of theological, because I believe, it's the practical application of theology in people's everyday lives and in policy, whether it's social policy, economic policy, or political policy, that leads us to really fulfill our role as the body of Christ and as Christians in this world. So what do we owe? So from the healthcare and policy perspective, as an OBGYN, I think that what this comes down to is optimal care for women and the mother. Now, no one would really argue with this. In fact, you can go so far as to note that the states of the United States and countries have a compelling legal interest in optimizing the care. Even if you don't care about anything else, they have compelling legal interest in optimizing the care of women and unborn children because complicated pregnancies and sick children are expensive. So even for those people who come from a completely utilitarian worldview, they're gonna take that position. But I would argue that we need to carry this further. I don't think anyone's would really disagree with that. But there's a recognition that an unborn child is as human as an adult, and therefore, since we fight against the commodification of adult human life. We fight against human trafficking, prostitution, so on and so forth. We should also likewise fight against the commodification of the unborn in the form of abortion, the commodification of conception, the use of fetal tissue, baby trafficking, whatever those things are. And that pregnancy is a blessing and can be redemptive. Many pregnancies arise in very difficult situations. And Sister Joy, I know that you're well aware of that for your work. But at the same time, I believe that there is a redemptive aspect to pregnancy. Again, just as the Jesus being carried by Mary was redemption for the whole human race. Of course, not every pregnancy is redeeming the whole human race, but it can be redemptive in so many ways. We see the theme of belonging to each other, even in the common interaction between people. I remember when I was pregnant, some people can't resist wanting to touch a pregnant belly. And I was always fascinated by that interaction because it wasn't that people were just curious. There was a recognition of the humanity of the unborn in wanting to touch this child. And I don't just necessarily want anybody to touch my belly, okay? But it was really quite fascinating to me that people that I didn't even know would say, oh, it's so beautiful, referring to the belly. Can I touch, can I touch? And it was interesting that there was a very fundamental human connection. And that's part of what I think we really struggle with in a lot of ways is that there is a dysynchrony between that attitude, but at the same time saying, well, the life of that child could be ended at an earlier stage. And moving into sort of the healthcare, I will tell you from many years in public health and OBGYN and in policy work as well, that healthcare should focus on optimizing health and outcomes for the unborn child and the mother. But that needs to extend to when a child is perceived as disabled or genetically disabled. We need to extend that same care and not to children that may not be expected to live, and to also care for them from the standpoint of the continuity of care for human life at all stages, and put the same energy into caring for women and their unborn children as we do for detecting and aborting children that are seen as abnormal. I want to draw your attention. Many of you have probably seen that article. There's a very interesting article called The Last Children of Down Syndrome in Atlantic Magazine. It's well worth looking at because it really looks at, the article itself is very curiously ambivalent about abortion. for children with Down syndrome. So it's quite fascinating how the author is wrestling with this, especially in countries like Denmark and Finland, for example, where pretty much the attitude is, well, we can eliminate Down syndrome. It's like, no, you're not eliminating Down syndrome. Down syndrome is a random genetic phenomenon. You're killing everyone who has Down syndrome. So it's an interesting article because it kind of gets at this. It's a fact, I will tell you, that maternity service in a hospital or in a clinic, either from, and also in the policy, so in other words, from both the policy and the service delivery perspective, are the least capitalized, they have the worst infrastructure, they're the most looked down upon and marginalized. And in general, it's quite striking. If you ever go to a hospital, look at the difference between the maternity ward and the newborn ward or the children's ward, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And so this reflects the dichotomy between our professed reverence for motherhood and the actual policy and health service delivery practice that goes on. And I think it's because of this ambivalence that we have towards pregnancy and pregnant women. Sorry. So what do we do about this? You know, from the policy perspective, I would say that we want to give, as Sister Joy was saying, we want to give pregnant women and the unborn the resources they need to thrive. And this has been definitely a policy emphasis we've seen over the last few years, both domestically and internationally. Since economic policy often, rightly or wrongly, aligns with and arises from social policy, there's a need to support mothers' maternity care as vigorously as we do other types of care, including and also abortion, which is not healthcare. So finally, to finish up, you know, we make decisions every day, as our panel, as my other panelists have noted, to support or not support women who are pregnant, especially those who are pregnant outside of marriage. I think we have a sentiment that the news media and culture determine or control popular attitudes, and I don't believe that. Those news media and popular culture merely reflect an unspoken consensus on these specific issues. And if we believe that God has delegated this authority to the church, according to Matthew 28, we now have the responsibility for our words and actions being consistent with what Scripture says. So where would I land this? I would say, again, as part of our understanding what we owe mothers and the unborn, and especially in belonging to one another, it's a recognition of the image of God in one another. It's looking at ways to enact policy that reflects the ethical principles that underlie our societal laws and societal doctrines, which are biblical in essence, and to remodel healthcare to reflect what we owe the unborn and mothers in order to really do away with this dichotomy between our reverence for motherhood and our disregard for unborn human life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wobenhorst. Your comments gave rise to so many questions that I want to ask myself. I won't be selfish, but one of the things I was thinking of when you were speaking about, you know, Jesus coming as a zygote, are the Flemish masters, when they painted pictures of the visitation, show it's kind of like this, pre-window to the womb where you see little unborn Jesus, kind of giving a thumbs up to little unborn John the Baptist. And it was a great recognition, again, from centuries ago, that unborn human life, and particularly our Lord and St. John the Baptist, were who they were when they were in their mother's wombs.
Yes,
Nothing
conceived who they were. That's right.
Correct, absolutely. But I just wanted to touch first, when you were speaking about women who are given adverse prenatal diagnoses, one of the things that I've been working on and writing on a little bit, I have a couple of articles at National Review and American Magazine, is about perinatal hospice. Mm-hmm. And women who receive that adverse perinatal diagnosis, where there's, in many instances, an automatic assumption they will terminate. And many are not told about the advantages that perinatal hospice provides, not only to the woman and to the child, but to the entire family unit, who is going to suffer at the loss of this pregnancy. I still find this an area of sort of pro-life activism that's largely unknown. And I'm wondering if you maybe could speak to that. Is it something that you come across in your practice in advocating for those who may have a short lifespan, who are born dying, but do they not deserve the same love and respect and protection from a violent death than any other ill or disabled child would?
No, absolutely. And we actually, I have some colleagues and I actually wrote a very long paper on this, not just in the context of perinatal hospice, because perinatal hospice is very much a part of the concept of providing optimal care for children who are born with disabilities. And we found some very surprising, there's actually a fairly well-developed literature, scientific literature on perinatal hospice that shows that parents who did it had better mental health outcomes and better long-term outcomes in terms of having been able to reconcile their child's death, even as it was clear that their child was not going to live. And the biggest example is, for example, children who are born with anencephaly, who are born missing really large parts of their brain. But that having that time and their family having that time to deal with that really, I think, gives an incredibly important window into how we view the sacredness of human life. I think there is a lot of emphasis on hospice. I think that when they went, and again, there was a comparison in these studies to parents who elected to continue their pregnancies and have a child who had a lethal fetal abnormality versus those who chose to have an abortion. The second piece that comes in here, which is, I think, extremely important to keep in mind, is that I have the greatest respect for my neonatology and pediatric colleagues because they are constantly pushing the boundaries. When I first started training a long time ago, the boundary for whether people would consider resuscitating a newborn who's premature was probably around 22 or 23 weeks. And those infants, this was when surfactant, which is what you use to help premature children breathe, was just being introduced. I mean, it was a research idea that was just going into phase 3 trials. But what's happened is that with the advent of all these technologies, we are now, that line is being pushed back further and further and further. Similarly, with children, for example, who have what might be considered lethal abnormalities, we have in utero surgery. We have all of these tools at hand. And I think that the constellation of resources that are available, whether it's perinatal hospice for an illness for which there is no treatment, whether it's optimal care for children with complicated problems, really is very powerful and is reflecting what I see as a real commitment to life at that stage and even before that stage. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
Oh, no, it does. And it reminds me a little bit of Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler's testimony at the March for Life 2 years ago, I think it was. She had a daughter diagnosed with Potter syndrome, so she had no kidneys. And she put out just a prayer request on Twitter, just please pray. And she's very pro-life. And she was contacted by a doctor at Johns Hopkins who said, listen, this is a theory. I think it might work. Do you want to be in this trial? And so what she had to go every week for an infusion of placental fluid. And then her daughter was born alive. Her husband donated one of his kidneys to his daughter, and she was the first child. And now she's not just the only child who has survived Potter's, she's just the first. Now,
right, exactly.
And so she was willing to take that chance and had, as you point out, a doctor willing to work with her to do that. And, I'm also mindful of like what Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said, Roe versus Wade is on a collision course with itself because his liability keeps getting pushed back and back and back. I have a nephew who was born at 22 weeks, 0 days, who is a very happy and healthy toddler today, with no long-term health issues or ramifications. So with a proper NICU available and a doctor willing to work with the family, we're seeing higher and higher success rates, which is a great encouragement. But just to kind of close the loop on the perinatal hospice piece, the other component of it that I think gives family great comfort is the possibility, at least, of tissue donation, if not outright organ donation. I have two friends who have used perinatal hospice, one for a case of trisomy 18 and one for a baby who had a very rare form of anencephaly, and not anencephaly, rather spina bifida. And my friend with the daughter who had the spina bifida case, the day we had the little funeral mass at our parish, when they got home, there was a letter from the Illinois Organ Donation Registry telling her about the two babies whose heart valves had been donated to. And these are two children who were critically ill, who very well may not have lived without that gift from her daughter. So, and she said, was I sad? Yes. But she said, I have never lost a night's sleep over choosing to let her live her life on her terms and to let God take her when he was ready to take her. And it gave life to two other families. So
that's a beautiful, I think that's a beautiful perspective. And it ties into something else that I wanted to bring up. One of the things that we deal with all the time in documents in the multilateral space, UN and international documents, even here in the United States, is people want to talk about being a productive citizen. And I really oppose that framing, because what that suggests is that if you are not productive, you are of less value. And eventually that undergirds ideas of eugenics and euthanasia and so on and so forth. Right. If we look at the example that you're talking about, where you have a child who has a lethal abnormality but is brought into the world and allowed to live life, as you, I think, beautifully said, on her own terms, that child has contributed to human flourishing in a way that a child who was aborted will never be able to do. And so we want to reframe that. And it's such an important idea that even those who are most helpless or most disabled by whatever circumstance they're suffering from, have an opportunity to contribute to human flourishing. And that, in the situation that you're referring to, it was both in a spiritual sense and in a sense of comfort to their parents as they walked with the child through their latter days, but contributed to materially to human flourishing because of organ donation. So I think that's a super important point to make. Yeah.
And if you could just briefly address sort of the number one objection I hear to that, and you see this on Twitter all the time, occasionally on Facebook, but especially on Twitter, where unborn children are now referred to by the acronym ZEF, standing for zygote embryo fetus. So you talk about dehumanizing. Now they're reduced to three. If you kind of watch, I follow a lot of the abortion providers and abortion groups, and now unborn children are ZEFs. So if you see that, that's what that means. But that the children who are born with life-limiting conditions are necessarily going to die, as one poster put it, screaming in pain. And I have an acquaintance who does perinatal hospice. She's a neonatologist at Northwestern University, Lurie Children's Hospital. And she said, I've never had a baby die screaming in pain.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
We address their pain. But can you speak to that just from a medical perspective?
The screaming in pain piece?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. But I think that the first thing you have to recognize is that pain is a phenomenon that is caused by infliction of injury or trauma or dysfunction. When you attend to, either from a nursing perspective or a physician perspective, when you attend to these children, as you said, they're not screaming in pain. Very often they're very peaceful, and they may be struggling. Their heart, especially, for example, if they have congenital cardiac abnormalities, they may be struggling to maintain blood pressure. But the idea of screaming in pain is really an adultification of something that is not occurring in the newborn. It's speaking to the fact that adults fear pain, fear screaming in pain, fear being out of control. And that's not the context that the newborn is experiencing their existence in. The newborn is experiencing their existence very much in connection with their mother and their family. And they are not, if they are experiencing pain, it's because, for the most part, it's because of some trauma that's inflicted upon them. You're putting in an IV or suctioning them or whatever.
There's an intervention of some sort. Yeah.
Right. There's an intervention of some sort going on. So I think that it's reflecting really an ignorance of the process of care. And then I think the other piece is that where because I worked a lot. People talk about OB/GYN as being very happy, but when it goes bad, it goes really bad. And so having walked with parents through the decline and deaths of their newborn, I think the interventions that we carry out do cause discomfort, but we medicate people who are uncomfortable, right? It's immoral to, if you're aware that a patient is in pain, unless they don't want pain medication, but it's immoral to not attempt to, relieve the pain through sedation or through analgesia. So I think that is just really reflecting a need to be educated about the whole process of perinatal hospice. And there's, like I said, there's a huge literature on this. It's something that's really gaining momentum and accelerating, and it gives better outcomes for health providers too.
Right. And certainly for the mothers. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wubbenhorst. That's and thank you for allowing me to prod you a little bit more on those.
No problem. Yeah, happy to do it.
Sister, I want to direct a question to you now, please. With the new administration coming in, there is, I think, great talk now about overturning the Hyde Amendment, which of course provides, if it's overturned, would provide vast federal funding for women who are living at or below the poverty line to have federally funded abortions. And when the Hyde Amendment was enacted, it was, very much initially saw as a way to protect minorities from pressure that oftentimes they felt to abort children who were, had been conceived at inconvenient times. I remember when I was a young lawyer, there was an initiative here in my state to reinstate state-funded public abortions, and I was outside of all places a church, gathering signatures, and I had a man who told me point blank, "Listen, I'd rather do abortion now than have to pay welfare for one of these people later." And he said it that crassly, and it breaks my heart even to say it, but I do think. From what I'm kind of reading online about how Hyde is now somehow discriminating against women of color and poor women. When I see it as simply another tactic to, eliminate the poor before they get here because they're such a difficulty. I know many of the women you work with are women of color or women who are struggling financially, but not all, as you've mentioned. Do you have any reflections on that? Has your community talked about ways in which you may change ministerial outreach based on a law that may change?
That's a good question, Mary. I think, we haven't, being here in New York, which has probably the most liberal or is the most hostile towards life. So we have thought a lot, or what we have seen, maybe is what I can share with you. So as you know, in 2018, they passed the RHA, the Reproductive Health Act here in New York, which then really allowed and opened up abortion to be much more available through 9 months. And what we had seen previously was when abortion was limited to 24 weeks, the amount of peace, often it was like we just had to accompany the woman to 24 weeks. Obviously, we accompanied her past that too. But she could actually enter into peace when she knew abortion was just sort of legally off the table. And I think with sort of what you're saying in some respects with the Hyde Amendment, we've seen really her peace being taken from her in regards to the RHA, where now for 9 months, she is in this dilemma and she can be really pressured by everyone in her life that she still has time, that she can still do it. Now there's even more money on the table. She can more easily get this taken away, this problem taken away, this life of the unborn. And it just complicates. It really makes her life that much more difficult. And she's not able to enter into peace at all during the pregnancy, and is kind of in this torn state the whole time. And what we had seen previously was really the ability to she was almost waiting for that benchmark to pass, and then she could just kind of relax and enjoy and really kind of delight in the fact that this little one was coming. And obviously it was a roller coaster still, but not to the same degree. And I think financially with now having just that capacity on the table, the pressure will increase from her family, from her friends, maybe from the father of the child, on herself. So in terms of our own community, what we have done yet, I don't think in many ways it will change for us here in New York, because things have been so hostile to life that she's really been able to get an abortion at any time. But that's what we've seen is stripped from her is any time of peace during this pregnancy. And there's been a real alteration in these last now almost 3 years with the RHA.
Yeah, we've had something similar in Illinois, and I think actually we may outdo you in Illinois in terms of the extremism of our abortion law here, because right after you passed your law, we passed one here, which again allows abortion for the entirety of the pregnancy, but also public funded abortion for any stage, no limit on the number of free abortions for any state employee or any woman who is a Medicaid recipient, which is in Illinois is a large number of people. But it also applies to women who come to us from out of state and use the meaning of presumed eligibility. So oddly enough, Planned Parenthood in the middle of the pandemic opened 2 new Mega Million clinics, one on the border of Illinois and Missouri, and one on the border between Illinois and Wisconsin. And all women from those states need to do is drive across the border, say, if I moved here I'm thinking about moving here to Illinois, and under presumed eligibility, I qualify for a free abortion. And even if you just Google some of the abortion clinics in Illinois, where can I get a later abortion in Illinois, it'll come up with the clinics, and then there'll be a call us if you need funding assistance right there with it. So I feel like it has taken away from women, like you mentioned, that safety net, or what was perceived as the safety net, like to say to the boyfriend, oh, it's too late now, I can't do it. Or, I would have to travel all the way to Colorado to have, this 32-week abortion. That's been taken from women. And it's, as you say, sister, it's one of those consequences perhaps we didn't even really think out in the pro-life movement, how that is adding to their fear and their anguish in their decision making. It's very troubling. But now, Vicky Thorne, I'd like to switch to you now, if we can, for a moment. When you were talking about the impact that the use of hormonal contraceptives has on the choice of mate for both men and for women, do you have, in your experience, appropriate ways to let people know, to let young women know before they go on the birth control pill for whatever variety of reason their doctor wants to put them on it, how life-altering taking daily hormonal contraceptives can be to their overall health, but also to their social well-being in terms of picking the right person to look for in a mate?
Well, my best answer to that is that I love to talk on campuses, and I get invited to talk on campuses, both to men and women, about this. But by the same token, by the time they're in college, many times this is too late. And again, when I get the opportunity, I raise it. Some of my talks are on Facebook in terms of people, if they want to access them. But that awareness that this isn't good medicine for people. It's not good medicine for our children, and again, that fallout in terms of the long-term familial possibilities of choosing a partner and all that kind of thing, it's not being talked about. And it is one of those, I don't like this language, but I'll use it, conspiracy of silence within the larger community, because we all know that contraceptives are so good and they're so useful, and they prevent all those unwanted babies from coming into existence. And women are not well informed on this. I mean, when I do work with women who've had abortions, or I do my talk on the biology, women come up and they're just shell-shocked. Nobody told me what this would do to my relationship. Nobody told me what it would do to my health, any of those things. And as people involved in the church in life issues, we have to find a way to get this information out there. It's very difficult because, the people who promote contraceptives do not want people talking about this. But we really have to do it because it changes people's lives in terms of decisions.
Yeah, thank you. And, Vicki, I remember when I took my daughter, who was then 16, to hear one of your presentations. And she had a variety of classmates at her Catholic high school whose mothers had put them on the pill pretty quickly, and not necessarily for contraceptive reasons per se, but, just in case thing. And so we were walking out and she said, "Mom, no one tells girls this stuff." She was just horrified. And so, a more organized information campaign, you're only one person, and I don't think we can clone.
I can't do that. But.
Oh, yeah, I don't think the church would like that, but to get that message out to women. And I was just pleased to see, like I said, when I began my remarks in Psychology Today, even mentioned that. So we do have a question from a listener, from legal scholar Erica Bacchiacchi, who would like to know, I think this would be more directed to Sister and to Monique, what kind of changes in legislative policies would you believe would actually help poor pregnant women? What are the laws that could be enacted that would really make it better and easier for you to serve the poor pregnant women who come to you?
I would say, I guess that's a great question and a big question, and there's so many areas. One thing I think that just comes to mind immediately is childcare. That we have seen be such a difficult piece to fill for women, and a real fear in how will I care for these children and work at the same time. So a policy, that would provide that in a really sustainable way that allows her to work and not lose her benefit of childcare is absolutely key, I think.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Wobenhorst, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've thought a great deal about how policy, and of course there's differences whether you're in the domestic or the international arena. I think domestically, policy, if you look at the sort of asymmetry between reproductive health policy, maternal policy, it's pretty obvious that we're devoting huge amounts of money to contraception, which clearly is not working because women have so many, quote, unwanted pregnancies. So my sense is that the legislative focus does need to be on encouraging women, especially right now, encouraging women to get into prenatal care as early as possible and encouraging them to be screened for comorbidities. We're seeing really an epidemic of maternal deaths. Maternal death is still relatively uncommon in the United States, but it's definitely higher than in other industrialized countries. And part of the reason is, I think actually a big chunk of the reason is obesity, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and so on and so forth. So I think that we need the legislative and policy focus should be on optimizing care for women early in pregnancy. Typically, for example, if you're in the public sector, receiving maternity care in the public sector, they're like, oh, have your pregnancy test and don't come back to us until like your 12 weeks. Well, by that time, you've missed some very critical opportunities for identifying women who are diabetic, hypertensive, have heart disease, so on and so forth. So I think that should be a huge legislative focus. And I think that our economic and other policy follows social policy. So if social policy is ambivalent about the value of pregnancy, that's going to be reflected in the economic policy. So again, I think the legislative, and a really interesting example of this is seen in Hungary. So Hungary, like most of Europe, was facing demographic winter, where natural births were not sufficient to sustain the population. And so you have essentially in Europe, Western Europe, you have an implosion of birth rates leading to rapid population aging. Same thing is going on in Russia, same thing is going on at a much accelerated pace in China, which is aging, where population is aging faster than anywhere else in the world. And population structure, the proportion of people at different ages in the population is changing incredibly quickly. But Hungary, interestingly enough, saw this as a threat to their existence as a country. And so what they did, and this is well worth looking at, is they created a number of incentives. Now, I'm just going to put a caveat in here that because they're a social democracy, they put things in place, sort of the mechanisms by which they put things in place would probably not be acceptable in our system of government. But again, it's well worth looking at. They highly incentivized marriage, and they highly incentivized carrying children to term through a variety of tax breaks, the availability of childcare, as you said, Sister Joy. And what's happening is that there is evidence that they are slowly turning this around. So I think the same type of approach that incentivizes women carrying to term, incentivizes marriage, of course, because we know that the biggest risk factor for poverty is being a single mom. And so those are the ways in which policy, you can study what another country has done and look at how policy can be influenced to become very pro-life, pro-family, pro-pregnancy, pro-mother.
And just, I guess, maybe on a more granular level, I have a friend who is a Black Protestant pastor and pastors a church on Chicago's South Side. And we had sort of a local issue here where one of our Catholic healthcare hospital systems wanted to open up a neighborhood clinic in his community. And of course, that neighborhood clinic was not going to prescribe contraception or even refer for abortions, much less offer them. And Planned Parenthood and the other, usual suspects mounted this huge public relations campaign against, I think it was Franciscan Healthcare, wanting to open this local neighborhood community healthcare center. And he wrote a letter to the editor that was marvelous, saying, you know what, we don't need more abortion and contraception in my community. What we need is hypertension screening. We need places that our community can go to get vaccinations and basic, urgent care health needs met. And he said, many of the people I pastor in my community, they don't have bus fare to go downtown or to get on the L and travel to and from a hospital that's in downtown Chicago. They need something they can walk to because they may not have transportation. And to criticize and demonize an organization that wants to come in here and help Black women with things like heart issues, healthy heart care. And as you mentioned, Dr. Wobenhorst, hypertension being an issue that community faces, and proper dietary interventions if that's necessary. He said, that's what we need in this community. We do not need more abortions and more contraception. We have that up to our eyeballs already. And I thought that he was so angry. He just said, this is just, the healthcare for Black people seems to be sort of at a knee-jerk level. Let's get more contraception and abortion into those communities because that's healthcare. Yeah. Doctor, were you saying something? You're muted. Okay.
No, I agree. I agree exactly. I mean, I think that this touches on the entire, what I see as just the tragedy of, African Americans are about 14% of the population, but the majority of abortions. And so proportionately, it touches on something that, we've spent a fair amount of time discussing, and not surprisingly, considering Planned Parenthood's eugenic past. But I think that is the point. And your pastor is right on. And it's really not, the opposition is not rationally based. It's simply that, if you try to stop this from happening, we need to oppose it, even though it's a net good for the community. So yeah, I think that's a good point.
And well, we have another question from Soren fellow Maggie Garnett. She asks, in a few weeks, many will gather to march and pray for an end to abortion. How, if at all, does what we owe mothers and children change if legal precedent and public policy better reflect the dignity of the unborn human person? How would what we owe mothers and children change if we had all those things, sister, like you mentioned, childcare vouchers and Monique, as you talked about, community health centers, and Vicki, as you've noted, full disclosure about the impact of hormonal contraceptives on the human body, but particularly for females? How would any of that change what we would owe? Would it remain the same, or does it morph into a different kind of obligation that we would have?
It's addressing it to me or to sister?
I would say, again, I kind of go back to some of what I said earlier. I think what we owe women, and I think Dr. Monique sort of highlighted this as well, are the commandments that Jesus has given us, these first two commandments, to love God and to love neighbor as ourselves. And so I don't think what we owe any human person changes based on policy. That is not primary. What is primary is our faith in Jesus Christ and who he says we are, and that, as you have both all pointed out, the dignity of the human person is not something earned.
That's right.
Or that we qualify for. It is given and entrusted to us, no matter what our capacities are, no matter what our race or economic standings or education background are. We are a wonder. We're created in the image and likeness of God, and it's staggering, the human person. And the only response, the proper response, is love. So I don't think policy would change any of that.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Sister Joy. I might reframe the question just a bit, because I agree with you, and this is something we fight about all the time, which is that human rights arise from the dignity of the human person. They're inherent to being created in the image of God, and therefore cannot be conferred by a state, nor can they be taken away by a state. At the same time, I think there's a sense in which this question is getting at what is the practical outworking of our theological position on the dignity of human life? And to the extent that the March for Life can help bring people together to think about a coherent approach, I think the March for Life just generates incredible energy. I mean, it's just amazing. Having been in Washington over the last few years when it was going on, it just kind of blows me away. I think to the extent that the march itself is a way, as I've said, of reflecting not an unspoken consensus, but a clearly spoken consensus, and where that consensus is manifest, and where we then say, okay, these are the policy tools that we can use in pursuit of this truth. I think that it could be very helpful. My sense is that we are going to need to do a lot with policy over the next few years, and to think very carefully about it and how to enact those policies. So I would just switch it around a little, which I think is what Sister Joy is suggesting, to say, I don't know that the March for Life will change the values upon which we want to build policy, but it can help crystallize them. And I think that is urgently needed right now. Sorry, that was a little long-winded, sorry.
No, that's very helpful, because it's it is sort of a multi-layered question, isn't it? And Sister, I love how you start with our basic duty to love the other doesn't change depending on what the law is. It might make it a little easier to love the other in some circumstances, but certainly our basic duty to love one another as we love ourselves remains and needs to remain operative. But I'd like to sort of, as we're winding down the time here, we've been talking on sort of a very practical and medical level. But what do you all see? And I'll start with you, Vicki, then go to Sister Monique. We'll end as we began. On a spiritual level, what kind of actions, or even what kind of things do you see that might be very troubling spiritually? There's a lot of talk now in public media about what it means to be a practicing Catholic. Can the unborn be excluded from the daily life of a practicing Catholic at this point? Can a practicing Catholic agree that the unborn is not worthy of protection and still be walking, with the Lord and close to Christ? I think a lot of this is going to come up for us, particularly as Catholics, in the next couple of years. And a lot of people are already asking questions about it. What does it mean to be a follower of Christ vis-a-vis women and unborn children? And Vicki, I'd like to start with you. I know that's sort of a tiny bit of a loaded question, but yeah. I do think it's the elephant in the room, right? I think we need to talk about how our duties as Christians, and particularly as Catholic Christians, called to be, and perhaps we'll all be voices in the wilderness. I don't know. Or perhaps we won't be voices at all, because we'll all have been, shut down and silenced. I'm not really sure. But what do you think? How should we be approaching this in terms of our prayer life and how we speak to others about how our faith manifests and motivates what we do?
Well, I think there's several pieces, and I think the importance of prayer is important. But I think the other question here is the need for pro-life people to find ways to engage other people in what we do. In terms of caring for the pregnant women, of finding ways to help their children, the women who maintain their pregnancy, but maybe a single mom. If we don't expand this beyond the philosophical, it's going to die, because that's what I see. I see that we're finding lots of ways to have the philosophical argument, and is that child human, and what does it mean, and all that. And I think we need to sort of regroup to talk actively about what this means to women in terms of the fact that they still carry the cells of this child, to look at the actual statistics of what happens to women who have abortions in terms of drug abuse, alcohol abuse, things like that. We also need to get the men involved, because the fathers have been set aside from the beginning, and the society has said to them, well, nah, you don't really matter here until the child is born, and then you'd have to provide stuff. That information that's there in science about how men are changed, to get that out there, because if I have a father who's actively engaged, it changes some of the issues for the woman. So often she's alone. And then we make a big deal about, there's no one there for you, dear, and, all that kind of thing. But to try to reassemble the couplehood and the importance of both partners being there for the child. And then again, to empower our congregations to speak. Our young people, if we get them on fire, are going to be very important in this. They have a real passion for life, but they don't have the tools. And so for those of us who've been in the pro-life movement, to find ways to get them the information, to find ways to teach them how to speak about it, how to companion, all those sorts of things, I think that we can hold the course. Okay, it's going to be difficult, though. This is not going to be easy.
No, thank you, Vicki. And Sister Monique, we each have 2 minutes left for both of you. Sorry, I need the Reader's Digest version of what you do.
No, I would say a couple of things. One, I would say education is a big piece. And even thinking something we haven't touched on, the John Paul II's teaching on the feminine genius, that this capacity we have to receive life is actually reflects something much deeper about the human person, the women, that we have a capacity to receive another, and that, abortion is a great crime against that, a real grievance against that. It takes away from our real strength as women, and that life has been entrusted to us in a very particular way. Mm-hmm. I think too that prayer for, obviously I'm the nun on the panel, so I'm going to highlight prayer, that this is a spiritual battle. Why is the human person under attack? Other than the fact that the enemy, Satan, is after God, in whose image we are made in. Mm-hmm. So absolutely, prayer is, again, our primary work. This is a spiritual battle. And again, to highlight that quote from John Paul II, maybe to end with, human life is always at the center of the battle between good and evil, between light and darkness. Mm. And it's a spiritual reality we have to face. So I think we have to be people of prayer.
And as you mentioned in your opening scripture quote, prayer and fasting. Some demons are only cast out with prayer and fasting. So thank you, Sister Monique. You get the last 2 words.
Well, I would agree very much with what Sister Joy said, coming from the Black Pentecostal tradition, where spiritual warfare is central to this. We underestimate our power in prayer. The extent to which we are consistent and united in prayer is the extent to which we will see change. And that change isn't just reflected in abortion, it's reflected in revival. We do need to see a revival. We are cognizant of sort of decline in the spiritual vitality of the nation, which not unexpectedly is leading to these moral and social evils. But I think that prayer and re-energizing the church awakening to her true calling as the bride of Christ and as the main way in which God works out his will in the earth is something that we have to recapture, and that everything else that we do, policy, practice, healthcare, our public speaking, whatever it is, has to flow out of that and be supported by that. And I know that we're going to be facing challenges, but at the same time, I can't emphasize strongly enough that the victory is only going to come as we really devote ourselves to prayer and intercession and fasting. So complete agreement.
That's a beautiful way to end it. And I would like to thank our panelists, Vicki Thorne, Sister Virginia Joy, and Dr. Monique Chireau Wubbenhorst for joining us today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.